Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Freeman. I'm a professor here at the School of Music and the Center for Music Technology at Georgia Tech. My training is as a composer. And what I want to talk about today is the role that imagination has always played in the act of composition, how technology has transformed that over the last 60 years or so, and how that transformation has really affected the way that I approach creating music. And so anytime I talk about composition, I have to start with this guy, Beethoven. Because, well, that's what composers do. Particularly, I want to start with this piece of music of his. It's his Opus 131 String Quartet. How many people here know the Opus 131 String Quartet? Okay, very good. It's a great piece of music. The rest of you should all listen to it. But for the rest of you, how many of you looking at this first page of the score here on the screen right now can imagine in your head what it sounds like? Show of hands. Okay, I'm very impressed by those of you that raised your hands. That means that you probably have a lot of background in music theory and a lot of experience as a musician to be able to look at a musical score, to look at the notes on the page and imagine in your head what it sounds like. This is something that musicians dedicate their entire lives to becoming better and better and better at as they study the craft of music. If you can imagine what composers have to do, it's kind of the opposite of this challenge. You have something in your head that you're imagining, and you have to figure out how to notate it as precisely as possible on a sheet of paper so that you can give it to someone, maybe hundreds of years later, who's never met you, and they can look at those notes that you've written on the page and understand what it was that was going on in your head when you were thinking of it. Beethoven was particularly good at this, and I picked a late work of Beethoven as a great example of this for one simple reason. When he wrote this piece, he was deaf. He had gotten so good at this over the course of his life, perfecting his craft of composition, that he didn't need to hear it anymore. He knew that he was so good, he could put down on the page and represent what was going on in his head, and he knew that he had done that job well. He didn't need the audio feedback coming back to know that he had done it the way he wanted. But if you look at this a little bit deeper than that Beethoven example, it's actually a bit more complicated than you might think. Because there's a lot of steps that things go through from the time they kind of start in the composer's brain until they get to the minds of listeners. Obviously, first, there's a musical score that gets created, and then there's a performer that actually looks at that score and doesn't just play literally what's on the page, but brings their own ideas and musicality into the mix, articulations and expression, dynamics and phrasing and tempo. This is the reason that thousands of string quartets have played the Opus 131 quartet and many other Beethoven works over the years. Every musician that approaches that piece has a new interpretation of it and brings a new perspective to the music. And then, of course, whether they're performing it in concert or recording it, when the sound of their instruments kind of goes into a space, it mingles with the acoustics of the space, and that affects the result of what we hear. Our ears affect the result of what we hear as well, the ways that our ears color and filter the sound that's coming in. And then, of course, we engage with it cognitively. We, as individual listeners, think about that music and come to our own understanding of what it means to us. And so there's this kind of crazy idea that's pervaded composition, the art of composition over the years, that something goes from the composer's brain into the listener's brain and kind of ends up intact by the time it's gone through all of these steps. And that's kind of silly. I mean, as a composer, I wouldn't actually want it to be that way. The idea that there's all these people along the way that put their own ideas into it and bring their own creativity and musicality into it in the act of performance and the act of listening is important to me. I want to put something out there and then see what other people might do with it. But not all composers want to do that. And particularly with the development of new technologies, starting maybe most notably with the reel-to-reel cassette deck, which grew into prominence and use in composition in the 1950s, composers tried to take more control over the music they were creating. If you can imagine, instead of writing a score that musicians then go and learn and practice and rehearse and interpret, you start writing something that ends up directly on magnetic tape. We used to call this tape music in the world of composition. Now we call it fixed media because no one writes for tape anymore. They write for MP3 files or CDs or whatever it might be. But you're no longer creating a score for someone else to interpret. The composer is really becoming a performer themselves. They're taking their ideas and they're actually rendering them directly into sound instead of notating them symbolically and letting someone else do that task. And so if you can think about how this works, a couple steps come out of that process. They still don't have total control because they can't go into a listener's brain and say, this is how you must hear this piece of music. But they've taken over this role of performance for themselves. And so there's two reasons this is really appealing to composers, I think. One is this idea of control, that there's no more uncertainty about how a piece will be interpreted or performed, but composers get to take control of that for themselves. And the other one, just to illustrate this, kind of the logical conclusion of where tape music has brought us is to digital audio workstation software, programs like GarageBand, which many of you I'm sure have used or seen or played around with, where you drag around audio files or MIDI clips and things on a screen, kind of creating this visual score of your piece. But there's a big difference between this and composing a score with pen and paper, which is you can hit the play button at any time, and you can hear exactly what it sounds like. You hear the finished product whenever you hit play, because again, there's no performers involved in this kind of after the fact. Your score goes directly into sound. Here, you hit play anytime you want. You hear exactly what it's going to sound like. What if I try this idea? Let me hit play. Oh, I didn't like that. Let me go back. Oh, and you iterate through this step by step by step until you arrive at something that is kind of the best possible version of what you want to put forward. There's a very powerful tool, this instantaneous feedback that lets you kind of iteratively revise your work and constantly hear what it's going to sound like. So this is all very powerful for composers, but to me it's always been a little bit, I guess for lack of a little bit better word, kind of depressing. And the reason that it doesn't appeal to me as a musician is that it takes out that element of collaboration, that element of uncertainty. I love being able to, I love the challenge of trying to imagine in my head what something's going to be like and the impossibility of that task. The process of giving it to someone else and saying, okay, I've taken this idea this far, now I want to see what you can do with it. And you might take it someplace that I didn't expect. You might even take it someplace I don't like, but that's okay because this is all part of a collaboration. And I want to see where you take it as a performer, and I want to see where listeners take it in their interpretation of the music. And so I've never actually written a piece of fixed media or tape music in my life. I don't use GarageBand or anything like that. But instead, my work is really inspired by a different trend that interesting enough, started developing around the exact same time that the reel-to-reel cassette deck became important in composition. And that's the idea of the open form in composition. To explain what the open form is, I thought I would go to the sculptures of Alexander Calder. A lot of you have probably seen the Calder sculpture that's about 10 blocks away from here at the Woodruff Arts Center, right in front of the High Museum. And what's interesting about Calder's work is that he creates all these different elements, all the different parts of the sculpture, but then they move as a mobile. And so the environment acts upon it, the wind might blow on it, move all these parts around. So every time I see a Calder sculpture, I have a very different experience of the work, because the elements of it are identical each time, but their arrangement with respect to each other and respect to the work as a whole change dramatically each time I see it, or even over the course of a single time that I see it. So if we were to take this idea of different elements that kind of constantly rearrange themselves every time we experience them, and take that into a musical score, we end up with something like this. This is a piece by Terry Riley. He wrote it in 1964. It's called In C. It's actually for any group of musicians to perform, and it consists of 53 musical fragments. The way you perform this is all the musicians start with fragment number 1, and they start playing it over and over and over again. And then when they get tired of that, they move on to number 2, and on to number 3, and on to number 4, and so on, until they get to the end. But the important thing here is that each musician decides for themselves when to move from 1 to 2, when to move from 2 to 3, when to move from 3 to 4. So these individual 53 fragments, they don't change from performance to performance. But the way that they're layered, the way that they occur kind of in simultaneity, changes dramatically from performance to performance. I've seen performances of this piece that last 15 minutes. I've seen ones that last 3 hours. There's all kinds of different possibilities in terms of the musicians that come together and the decisions they make when they're rehearsing and preparing and presenting a performance of this piece. And each time it's dramatically different. It's no longer just making decisions about articulations and dynamics. It's really making fundamental decisions about the musical content and how it's arranged and contextualized in the performance. And just to bring things full circle for a second, here's a piece by Earl Brown. It was written in 1966 called Calder Piece. And Earl Brown actually commissioned a sculpture from Alexander Calder to accompany this performance. It's for 4 percussionists. And at different times in the performance, they're instructed to look at the sculpture and the arrangement of the elements in it and use those as cues for which sections of musical fragments they should be playing at any given time. So this idea of the open form has been very influential to me. I think it's a really powerful idea as a composer for me to give up some of the control I might typically have as a composer and give it to performers. But there's always been a critical question that I've wondered in this whole process, which which is what about the audience? A lot of these works end up being these kind of almost inside jokes between the performers and the composer. The audience never gets to see the score. They never really get to understand how this dynamic collaboration is unfolding. And so that to me is a shame, because it's such an interesting and integral part of the music. And so my artistic practice over the last decade or so has really been concerned with taking this idea of the open forum and using technology as a way to integrate the audience and their experience of the music more directly into this idea of the open forum. So I want to briefly talk about two recent works of mine that approach this from very different angles. The first one is a piece called Piano Etudes. I wrote this in 2009, and it's a series of short pieces for solo piano that are open forum scores. Here's one of them. It's called Learning to Dance. It's 2 pages of music. 1 page is for your right hand, and the other page is for your left hand. And you can start on any of these boxes of musical fragments that you wish, and then follow the arrows to kind of create your own path through the composition. So that's kind of the classic open forum aspect of this work. But then I also developed this website that looks a lot like the musical score. And as you go through the musical score on the website, anyone can go and create their own version. You don't need to read music because it shows it in a graphical notation. You can click on any fragment and get immediate feedback on what it sounds like, and then click on them and add them to a timeline at the bottom of the screen to create your own version. Once you've created a version that you're happy with, you can share it online, via Facebook or however you like. But very importantly, you can also hit a button that says Print Score. And when you hit that, it actually gives you a PDF file that you can download. It takes your version that you created, turns it into traditional music notation that any pianist can then practice and perform in concert. This is a very important idea to me. This doesn't just kind of expose the open forum and how it's working to the audience, but it actually gives them a chance to get involved and to influence how future performances of the work transpire. And one of the ways we did this was through contests. And so a couple of years ago, I collaborated with the New York Times, and we invited New York Times readers to submit their own versions of the etudes to our website. Jenny Lin, the pianist who commissioned this piece, and myself then reviewed all of the submissions and picked our favorites. Jenny recorded them in a studio. We posted those recordings to the New York Times website, and they've also been presented in concert several times since then. I want to play one of these. It's a version of Learning to Dance, the score I just showed you, by a gentleman named Evan Hill. So I want to talk about one more recent project of mine now to close. It's called SGLC. It's a piece I composed for violin, cello, flute, bass clarinet, and 4 laptops. And I didn't think that was funny at all. And the basic question it asks is, what if instead of creating one of these open forum scores with arrows and, and boxes and things, where people can kind of choose their own path through a piece, what if I created a programming language that let people actually write code that navigated this, all the possibilities here? And what if the act of performing this work were actually an act of sitting down with a laptop and writing that code live in performance? Not so different from what Mark was just doing in his talk. And so this draws from 2 kind of recent trends in the area of computer music research. One of them is live coding. And the idea behind live coding is that you get up with a laptop, blank screen that's projected so the whole audience can see it, and you start writing code in some programming language that starts algorithmically generating the music the audience hears. So it takes programming, which is normally this very solitary activity, and it turns it into a very public event, and really a kind of a virtuosic act of musical performance. The other idea behind this is real-time music notation. And the idea here is simply that the algorithms that you're writing, instead of generating a bunch of bleeps and bloops that come out of speakers, are actually generating music notation that's displayed on a computer screen that instrumental musicians sight read in the performance. And this aspect is very important to me because it takes all those centuries of experience that we have in the rich acoustic instruments we've developed and the performance practices surrounding them, and it brings them into this kind of environment that is still very kind of high-tech and interactive. And so what I did with this particular piece is I composed about 50 short musical fragments. These are some of them on the screen here. But you can see they're not connected by boxes or arrows or anything like that. Instead, students and myself in my research lab here at Georgia Tech developed a very simple programming language called LOLC. And this is what it looks like when you boot it up on your laptop. It looks almost more like an instant messaging program like Skype than a programming language. Everything you type in it is only one line of code. You type in text chat messages to chat with the other laptop musicians if you like as well. And essentially what it's all focused on is generating very simple musical motives and transforming existing ones. And anything you do in this language is shared with every other laptop musician on your local network, the other people you're performing with. So when I create something, it gets shown on the left side of the screen there, so someone else can take it and transform it and play it and make it their own as well. This comes from kind of one of the most fundamental ideas of group improvisation in music, which is that you listen to the people around you, you steal what they're doing, you change it a little bit to make it your own, and then you kind of use that in what you're doing. It's a key way that musicians collaborate when they're improvising. And then all of this stuff, like I said, is not generating sound out of speakers, but is generating music notation. And so the instrumental musicians see something that looks like this, where they're actually sight reading this music in concert. There's a little bouncing ball that acts as a kind of conductor for them so they can stay in time with each other. And they add a lot of their own expression to this, their own ideas about they listen to the other musicians and add their own ideas about articulation, dynamics, and balance, and phrasing, and so on and so forth. I want to play you a short video clip of this from a recent concert. This is a performance by Sonic Generator, which is the chamber music ensemble that's in residence here at Georgia Tech. So it's done at the Woodruff Arts Center here in Atlanta in February. There's 8 musicians on stage, 4 instrumental musicians and 4 laptop musicians. Each of the laptop players is generating music for one of the instrumental musicians. And 2 final points to make here. First of all, this programming language is very accessible to anyone, whether they programmed or not before. You can learn it in a couple of hours. And so that's one way that we kind of expose this idea of the open forum to folks beyond just myself and the performers. But also you probably saw a video projection there that shows all the things that everyone's typing in, the text chat messages and the code that they're typing in. And so this, to me, is a key way of showing to the audience how this collaboration is unfolding, how people are engaging with this environment to create the music and performance. Thank you very much.